Welcome back to Freedom Friday, another Black History Month edition of Freedom Friday. I'm Conroy Reynolds. Did you know? Long before Africans were allowed to read the Bible freely in colonial churches, an African king was reading it in an African script that he himself invented. This episode focuses on one of the most remarkable African rulers of his time, Sultan Ibrahim Njoya. Not only was he king of Bamum, which is now in Cameroon, he was a linguist who created his own language, a historian who chronicled the history of his people, a theologian who studied Christianity, Islam, and the indigenous religion, a diplomat, and a poly-mathematician. His life and work defied every stereotype the Europeans were so busily propagating to support their exploitation of Africa and its people. Join me now in this fascinating exploration of this remarkable African. In 1886, the Kingdom of Bamum, located in what is now Western Cameroon, crowned its 17th Sultan Ibrahim Njoya. He succeeded his father Nsangu and ruled until his death in 1933 when he was succeeded by his son Sidu Njimolo Njoya. The royal family had ruled this kingdom for over 400 years. And so began the reign of one of the most remarkable African rulers of his or any other time. But before looking at his accomplishments, let's briefly review the contextual situation in which King Njoya began his reign and which he had to contend with throughout his rule. It would greatly enrich our understanding of this great African. So, in the late 1900s, European greed and rapacity plunged Africa and its people into another dark period of their long history as the founders of human civilization. The European colonizers would bleed the continent of its most precious resources, its land and people. Over 90% of the continent would be swallowed up in the ensuing conflagration known as the Scramble for Africa. You've heard about it, I'm sure. It is ironic that at a time when the enlightened European scholars, so-called enlightened European scholars and writers, were writing about the so-called dark continent, their governments had been overseeing the greatest period of darkness the continent had ever known. Keep in mind, the continent had already endured the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade for centuries. Now the colonizers wanted more. This was the dark specter confronting the new king. Sultan Ibrahim proved to be a wise, visionary, and learned ruler. He is best known for his four greatest but interrelated achievements. The first of which was to create a new language, the Bamum script, a fully functional written language developed through several stages. It was used for court records, history, science, religion, and diplomacy. He also built many schools to teach the language. The significance of this achievement must be understood in the light of the efforts by the European colonizers to impose their language onto the Africans. The great African scholar Sheikh Anta Diop has pointed out that language is the characteristic of cultural identity par excellence. He cites the French intellectual Montesquieu, who wrote, "As long as a conquered people has not lost its language, it can have hope." So aside from demonstrating his amazing intellectual powers, inventing a new language was a powerful resistance strategy in and of itself. It freed the government from relying on Arabic or European scripts and thereby strengthened indigenous governance and countered colonial dependency. King Njoya no doubt understood whoever controls the script controls interpretation, meaning, history, and truth. Next, Ibrahim Njoya turned his attention to perhaps the most critical aspect of his work on behalf of his country, compiling its history. He wrote with the help of scribes extensive historical chronicles of the Bamum people, preserving African history in African hands. As Dr. Diop notes, a people without a historical consciousness is just a population. History and language constitute the most salient dimensions of individual and social identity. So it was an act of self-reliance and independence to write the history of his people. He also commissioned and oversaw the first surveyed map of his kingdom, known as the Book of the Country. Now, take a look at the image on this slide. It is the image of a page from what is commonly known as King Njoya's Bible. However, King Njoya never wrote his own Bible. He did translate, interpret, and contextualize biblical ideas through the African intellectual framework. This page is the Bible in Bamum script. We have heard of European missionaries translating the scriptures into some local languages, but this is an African translating it into an African language. After German missionaries brought the Bible to Bamum, the king studied it carefully, comparing it with the Quran and African indigenous beliefs. And from that study, he produced religious texts in the Bamum script, as you see here. He developed theological summaries of biblical and Islamic teachings, ethical codes influenced by scripture, and instructional texts explaining monotheism to his people. In this way, he took ownership of their religious instructions instead of leaving it to the missionaries. He believed and taught monotheism, and that the Bamum way, the Christian way, and the Muslim way were all ways of seeking the one God. However, he developed an ethical monotheism, emphasizing that the most important thing was justice and right conduct. He did not believe religious differences should result in hatred and wars. A person should be known by their actions, he taught, not by the name they claim. Thus, he showed himself to be an African religious intellectual, which directly contradicts the colonial portrayals of African rulers as superstitious, incoherent, and dependent on missionary theology. He even founded a new religious movement, drawing on the teachings of the Bible, the Quran, and indigenous beliefs. Well, this was not exactly what the missionaries had in mind. A critical aspect of colonialism was the misuse of the Bible to support the subjugation of Africans. To accomplish this feat, they relied on the people, looking to them for guidance and instruction in the scripture. German missionaries had come to Bamum because Cameroon was supposed to be the German portion of Africa, or at least part of it. Sending in the missionaries was an important part of the strategy, but King Njoya upended the strategy. He refused to accept the colonized Bible and the colonized religion. Instead, he encountered the God of Scripture on African terms. Of course, as you would expect, none of this sat well with the European colonizers. An African king leading his nation toward independence and self-sufficiency would limit the extent to which they could dominate and exploit the country for their benefit. Moreover, other African leaders might be encouraged to travel a similar path, leading Africa towards the fulfillment of its enormous potential. King Njoya, on his part, underestimated European greed and determination and mistakenly believed he could negotiate a peaceful coexistence with them. Rather than protect the boundaries he worked so hard to demarcate on his survey maps, he compromised them. Eventually, the French, who after the First World War had replaced the Germans, they were defeated in the World War, the French had replaced the Germans as the region's colonizers, removed him from power in 1931. They exiled him from his homeland, destroyed many of his manuscripts, and closed his schools, setting the nation's development years backward. And he died 2 years later. However, one of his many sons eventually regained power. To the end, the king maintained he was the rightful ruler of the Bamum people, that he was unjustly removed, and he expressed the belief that the Bamum people would remember him and his work. And so they have. Today, the mansion King Njoya built is a museum displaying the royal history of Bamum sultans. Among the Bamum people, Ibrahim Njoya is not remembered as an exile, a defeated exile, but as the king who gave his people writing, memory, and intellectual sovereignty. Scholars such as Claude Tarditz have described him as one of the most innovative African rulers of the colonial era, and modern Bamum cultural leaders speak of him as the ruler who made us known. His script, his archives, and his vision preserved a civilization under pressure. Though the French removed his crown, they could not remove his legacy. In his country today, his story stands as a living proof that African genius was never absent, only suppressed. And like the blessing promised to Abraham, that legacy endures, reminding us that dignity rooted in truth cannot be ever erased. Thank you for joining me on another History Month edition of Freedom Friday. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast. And until next week, remember, truth pressed to earth will rise again. Dr. Martin Luther King. Stay alert and stay free. This is Freedom Friday, where we tell the whole story.